Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today I'd like to speak about some of the interesting releases over the past month. And there's been a great deal released over the past month from a variety of different brands, and so in this video I really am just covering what I view as the most important or the most interesting. And so as a result I won't be covering the dial changes, for example, that one often sees when one sees an existing watch with a new style of display or dial. And so this is why these Sinns which have been released this month are placed here in the intro as opposed to later on in the video, because I think a lot of people will be interested in these new pieces, but I don't think they deserve a full discussion because I've spoken about these watches before. But they include a new version of the very famous Sinn U1 dive watch, which is their technical 1000-metre dive watch with the submarine steel case, which is now available with a powder blue, sort of matte blue dial, which is a very attractive option and slightly less military than their previous versions. And one also has two new versions of the very famous Sinn 104, which is their all-purpose style of pilot's watch, which is now available with an anthracite sunburst dial or a dark blue one, both of which I'm sure will be very popular as a result of adding a little bit of colour and a bit of difference to their previously very much monochromatic dial range. Now the first piece I would like to speak about is also a model from Sinn. However, this piece is really unique in their range and follows on from a piece released in 2016. And this is the Sinn 1800 Damaszener, which is a 43mm watch which follows a very simple formula where the case design is concerned and the design of the watch is concerned. However, this is a piece which celebrates material and Sinn's ability to craft it into their own particular purpose and function. Now the key element to know about this watch is that it's made out of Damascus steel, and Damascus steel is essentially a combination of high-grade steels as is stated by Sinn, but it's produced in a very traditional sort of way, because this is a type of material which has been used for centuries really in terms of producing blades and swords, for instance. And the way it's made really is through a process of welding and forging with layering in between, and this creates this sort of lattice, if you will, of different layers of different grades of steel which together come together to produce a very strong and extremely resilient form of steel. And this is not often seen in the watch industry because it's a very complicated process and a very expensive process to pursue if you're going to make these on large scale. And also one has to note that with this watch there are some components which are manufactured in very different ways, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But the general design of the watch is a 43mm form of sports watch with luminous hands and markers on the dial. And the case itself is as I've said, a very conventional form with very conventional lugs and with a tall bezel to protect the crystal. One also has an unguarded crown to add a certain dressy element to the watch, because bearing in mind the product with its very interesting surface of metal, one would want to be able to show this watch at more formal events as well. Of course, despite these elements of a slightly more dressy form, this piece does retain all of the resilience which is characteristic of Sinn's products. So for a start, it's water resistant to 100 metres, in addition to having resistance to negative pressure, so if ever you were in an aircraft and suddenly the cabin were to decompress, the crystal wouldn't be blown out, which is a rather crucial element to a pilot's watch, but something which I feel is excellent that Sinn include throughout their range. One also has a double-side anti-reflective sapphire crystal on the front, which is appreciated, in addition to the fact that the case is tegimented. And what this means is that the surface of the case is hardened to a point where the case is extremely resilient to scratches. Now this means the case is approximately 4 times, for some of their cases, harder than conventional stainless steel you would see on most watches, which is a very impressive level to be able to reach, and does allow these watches to just be all the more practical for use every day. Of course the watch is also anti-magnetic and shock resistant, and beating inside it is an ETA 2892-A2. And whilst this may seem like a quite conventional movement to most, I must say the grade and the quality of Sinn movements is always superb. Now from my experience with Sinn watches, the accuracy is always very, very good, and really within cost chronometer parameters if you look at, for example, my Sinn 104, which I think is extremely impressive bearing in mind the price of their watches. And whilst this piece does come in very much at the top of their range where prices are concerned, I think this is a very good choice of movement, bearing in mind the fact that this was a movement which was designed initially to be used in ultra-slim watches in the 1960s, and has been developed since then, and so I think one shouldn't underestimate it, despite the fact that one sees it quite regularly in the industry. But as ever with this sort of watch, the detailing is what really makes the product. Because the Damascus steel has this very interesting graining to it, which looks almost wood-like, as a result of the layers which are pressed into each other and indeed welded together before being reforged and cut, before being reconnected together again, in order to form this particular lattice. And in older metallurgy this is done very many times before the end product is produced, But of course, in the context of a watch case, this is all the more complicated because the individual types of steel used have to be able to withstand the corrosion requirements of a case, which wouldn't be the case with a sword, for instance, where the ultimate hardness of the tip and the flexibility of the sword are the most important components. But the interesting thing is seen on the dial, because you'll notice the dial also follows the same lines as the rest of the case, and the reason for this is that it's one piece. Now this is quite a remarkable feat to be able to incorporate together, but one is able to see the fact the dial is actually attached to the rest of the mid-case, which is rather interesting. On top of this, one also sees applied indices, and these are black-edged, which match the hands, and of course the whole package is luminous in the dark. Then one sees on the dial very simple signing with simply Sinn, the name of the watch, and then a black-rimmed date window at 6 o'clock, which allows the whole watch to take on a uniform and extremely well-balanced form. Now, of course, the price for this watch is relatively elevated as a result of the fact that it is a limited run of 100 pieces, but also a piece which is difficult to make, especially with a matching buckle as well as a matching case bag. And so the price in the UK is £7,845, which I think is, of course, a lot of money, bearing in mind the fact that Sinn don't have quite the recognition amongst most people of much larger brands. But I think this piece is something which will stop a lot of people in their tracks in terms of thinking, because it does offer something just entirely different to other alternatives at this sort of price range, with incredibly impressive specifications, and the making of a watch which could really satisfy someone from both an aesthetic and a technological perspective. Now, Breitling have also had quite an interesting month, because they've released a new set of watches under their Premier collection. And this is a new collection which follows on from an original collection from 1943, which takes a more subtle and dressy approach to chronographs and three-hand watches alike. But I think what's interesting about this range is that as 4 watches have been released, we're able to see a similarity with their release of the new style of Navitimer earlier on in the year. And this shows a brand which is incorporating both their in-house movement as well as more stock movements in terms of their architectures into a single range to create perhaps a more homogeneous sort of collection as a whole. And so this range goes with a single watch with small seconds, one with the day-date complication, one with a Veljo 7750 based movement, and of course their BO1 in-house chronograph. Now really this range is broken into 2 halves, because one has the 40mm three-hand versions and the 42mm chronographs. And amongst the three-hand versions one has 2 models, and so the first of these is the automatic day-date. And this is in many ways the most simple and conventional of the range, which uses a caliber 45, which is essentially an ETA 2834-2, which of course runs at 4Hz, has 25 joules, and a 40-hour power reserve. This also comes with either a black or a silver dial, to give a lustrous but still very mid-century style to this watch, which the whole range is going for that 1950s sort of aeronautical travelling sort of theme, which I think works very well for this brand and also this range. And so in this piece one sees a great deal of lustre on the dial, with a bright but in many ways somewhat cluttered dial as a result of having the date and the day of the week, although I think that's balanced very well by the fact they're vertically orientated to help the whole watch. I feel the alternative in the range though is possibly more interesting, because the version which uses the caliber 37, which is the no-date version of this watch, however now has a very different dial layout, because it uses the caliber 37, which is essentially in ETA 2895-2. And what this means is there's no date, but instead there are small seconds at 6 o'clock, which are balanced perfectly really between the bottom of the dial and the centre stack of the hands, and this helps the dial have a great deal of balance. This is also sunken with a contrasting white ring around the colour of dial, which again helps with the balance of the dial and helps to bring out the colour whether you go for the anthracite dial, the blue or the silver. And so as a result of this, I think this is a more interesting timepiece as a whole, because it gives something a bit more different to the standard Breitling range. And I think rather crucially this model will receive much less kickback than the three-hand Navitimers released earlier on in the year, because this watch was never intended to be purely a chronograph, but rather takes a rather more relaxed form in the case of this three-hander. However, I do find the price of these versions quite high, at $4,450 to $4,750, depending on whether you go for the strap or the bracelet. Where the 42mm chronograph versions are concerned, one has a very different style of variation between the 2 versions available, because in this case they're far more defined by price than indeed by producing different functions. Because one sees in the less expensive of the 2, a 42mm case as per the name, running at the caliber 13, which is essentially a Velour 7750 which has been modified, and so retains a 25 joule layout, running at 4 Hz with a 42-hour power reserve. And so this gives the characteristic vertical chronograph arrangement, although I feel the design of this case is still very attractive with bevels and those beautiful squared pushers. One also has an included tachymeter underneath that boxed sapphire crystal, which allows one to be able to measure speed, but I think the interplay between the white ring of that tachymeter around the sunburst dial is extremely well considered and very, very classically correct. Of course, one does have several colours for the dial which are blue or black, with this sunburst effect to them with sunken subdials, and so I think as a whole this is a very handsome piece, and runs at a slightly higher price to the 3-hand versions of $6,250 to $6,550. The most attractive piece in the collection, though, is rather predictably the most expensive, and this is the Premier B01 Chronograph 42, and takes the same style of 42mm case as its less expensive counterpart, but adds to it the in-house caliber B01 chronograph. And this means that instead of having the 3 subdials, you only have 2 now, which does mean that technically you lose functionality. However, in exchange for that, you get a more balanced layout with the running seconds on the left, and on the right the 30 minutes of the chronograph. One also still retains the days at 6 o'clock matching the dial colour, in addition to having a 70-hour power reserve, and still running at 4 Hz and being automatic. And I do feel that with its 47 joules and its blue or indeed silver dials, this piece is the most appealing, because its dial layout does give you that style of panda dial, in addition to also having a black ring around the very edge of the dial on the silver version, giving a very attractive look and a very refined aesthetic to what is a nice balance between a sports chronograph and something far more dressy. And so the price for this range-topping model is $8,400 to $8,700, depending upon the strap option you choose, so that's whether you choose the strap or the bracelet. But I feel what's most interesting about this range is the fact that it does show the direction Breitling are going in, to have this sort of hierarchy of lines, which are very heavily ordered with a similar aesthetic throughout, by having the non-in-house movements at the bottom, and then a single range-topping in-house movement at the top. And so one does have an interesting layout, which I think says a lot about Breitling as a brand, and the way they're restructuring as time goes on. The third watch I'd like to speak about is a new piece from Bremont, and this is a brand which I don't often speak about on this channel because I don't often speak about the realms they appeal to, but also I don't tend to speak about some of their watches because they don't personally appeal to me. However, the new release of the Bremont Supersonic 8-day chronometer has been a very, very interesting one, which harks back to the days of Concorde, and indeed the days of luxury travel at great speed with this airliner. And the case itself of this watch, being a more of a dress watch, is 43mm in diameter by 14.56mm thick, meaning it's no small watch, but I think with good reason, because this is the sort of watch you could enjoy wearing as you travel, as you move around the world, but as a general wear watch which will serve you extremely well with 100-metre water resistance. And so I feel there's much more to this watch than would be given credit for if you simply spoke of this watch as being a dress watch. Now, the dial of this watch is something which is uniformly considered with the case to really hark back to the days of Concorde as something of a celebration of its design, but also of its form in the air. And so one sees touches of the Concorde in the movement, and for example the crown, which is signed with these Concorde forms. But the dial itself is finished in this silvery colour, which is of course a sunburst effect, and pays homage to the reflective paint of the Concorde. One also sees, especially on the steel version, which has blued hands, the red and blue which was seen on the British Airways livery of these planes, which has become truly iconic. Now, it should be noted, though, that the watch is also available in rose gold and white gold, and for these versions the dial does change somewhat, because whereas I like the steel version best because it has these painted numerals, which make them very clear and black on this silver dial, they have applied indices and numerals in the same colour of gold as the case. This is also the case with the hands, and one sees extra detailing where there's applied gold to the dial around the subdial, but also around the date window, for instance, and so this constitutes the change between the models. Otherwise, these pieces do share the same design, and also share the triptych case these watches have, with that black layer around the centre. Now, the detailing on the dial of this watch really is superb, as one sees sunken subdials, with at the bottom of the dial the date, which is cut out of the subdial, which shows the seconds, which is also textures itself. But one also has at 12 o'clock the addition of this rather interesting power reserve meter in red with a sunken form as well. And the interesting elements of these is they're run off a movement which is unique to this watch as of the present time, and it's the caliber BE11M, and it's the first 8-day manual movement from the brand, and runs at 3 Hz with 33 joules and has a glycodur balance, as well as an anachron balance spring and a Neverflex mainspring. But the general design of this movement is most interesting, because it takes a very, very decorated form with a great deal of finishing seen throughout the movement to create a very interesting movement to look at through the caseback. And of course, most crucially, it has the Concorde's shape cut out of one of its bridges, just to add a certain amount of interest to the movement. Now, whilst looking at the back of the watch, one should also look at that ring which surrounds it, because that's an aluminium ring which has been taken from Alpha Bravo, which is Heathrow's last Concorde, which is quite an interesting touch to this watch, and does follow on from other watches made from Bremont as the concept of taking parts from other machines or indeed historical parts to create elements of the watch, and I think they've done a very good job in the case of this piece. One aspect of this watch which I really have to mention just because it's the most fantastic of gimmicks I've seen in a very long time, which is seen in the way the watch is presented in its case, which comes in the form of a stand with the Concorde nose cone, from which the watch emerges, which is rather an interesting design, and I think a really clever way of presenting a watch in relation to the Concorde as an incredible piece of design in its own right. Of course, these pieces are limited editions, bearing in mind their connection with an individual Concorde, but also with the components added to the pieces. And so for the stainless steel version, you'll be paying £9,495 for 300 pieces. For the rose gold version, it'll be £16,995 for 100 pieces, and for the white gold, it'll be £17,995, again for the same 100-piece run. But I think these are very interesting options and an interesting alternative to existing models on the market, with a unique case form and a very interesting design. Now, the penultimate pieces I'd like to speak about are 2 new models from FP Journe. And FP Journe is a brand which is essentially unique on the market, with a very interesting drive behind it, and really an interesting combination between modern watchmaking and watchmaking of the 18th century. And their sport line has always been an acquired taste, and one which I must say I didn't have for quite a long time. But having seen these watches and indeed discussed them, I must say they're something which are growing on me in terms of the way they apply to the range, and whilst I probably wouldn't wear one, they are a very interesting alternative to existing models on the market. And they've updated their line to 44mm, and previously they were 42mm and really were discussed and viewed as large as FP Journe would ever go. And so moving up to 44mm is quite a striking change, but I think they've pulled it off rather well, because these watches focus on lightness through their cases, movements, and designs. Now, this new collection comprises 2 new models, but there are several elements which are shared between both. And so what one sees as taken over from older models is the use of this particular titanium case design, which as you can see is bead blasted in this case, and it should be noted that 18-carat hammered red gold versions and platinum cases will also become available in future. But at the moment they have this very traditional titanium case for the range, because it gives an extremely light and very strong build, with rubber inserts on the sides of the bracelet, the sides of the case, and also around the crowns of the watches. In addition to this, one sees aluminium movements, and so their movement plates are made from aluminium for lightness, which is a very interesting material to use, as it's not really an orthodox choice for a mechanical movement, and especially one designed in such a traditional and very interesting way. But aside from the new size of case, one also has a brand new lacquered bright yellow dial, which is also seen in contrast to the new ceramic bezel, which is fitted to these watches. But before I speak about the more complicated of the two, I'd like to speak about possibly the more easy to understand at first, and the one which is most approachable. And this is the Octa Sports ARS2, which is a 44mm by 11mm three-hand design of watch, with the addition of a power reserve indicator, a large date, which is the most large change by comparison to its older counterpart, and a day-night indicator. Now, whilst one sees all of these complications on the dial, such as the bolted-on small seconds at 6 o'clock, this is a highly functional watch as the hands as well as the dial are luminous to allow you to see the watch in the dark. And beating inside this watch is the caliber 1300-3, which is an automatic 6-day power reserve movement with a free-sprung balance and, of course, aluminium construction. And I think you'll agree the detailing on the movement is absolutely wonderful, There's extreme decoration around the balance and around the various plates, which aren't really obscured by the rotor, which is a nice element. And the weight for this piece remains at 75 grams, making it a very light option on an integrated bracelet, with a price of 36,000 Swiss francs. The other version now available is the Centigraphe Sport CTS 2, and this is in many ways a much more complicated watch, because it features the caliber 1506, which was seen in the previous version, and some manually wound 80-hour chronograph movement with a very abnormal display on the front with these 3 subdials. And of course this watch does run conventionally with the hours and the minutes being luminous, in addition to the rest of the dial also having luminous elements so you can read it in the dark, but really the movement is the centrepiece of this model. And the 1506 provides the complication of a single second counter, and one sees this on the left hand side of the dial, and so that hand rotates around its own subdial once every second to allow you a very, very close measurement of time. One then has the seconds running in 20-second runs per orbit of its subdial on the other side of the dial, and then a 10-minute counter at 6 o'clock. Now, whilst the watch has an 80-hour power reserve when fully wound, as a result of the fact that it uses a single spring to power both functions of the chronograph and the standard timekeeping, if one runs the chronograph, one does drop the power reserve to only 24 hours. But then again, the movement on this piece is another thing of absolute beauty, with its manually wound architecture allowing you to really see into it and allow you to examine the very workings of the movement itself through all its aluminium glory. And the price for this watch is 56,000 Swiss francs, and so of course neither of these watches are inexpensive, but I must say with the craftsmanship that goes into FP Journe's watches, they really are quite incredible marvels of the watchmaking world. The final piece I'd like to speak about is most likely the most grand, and this is the Lange Söhne Datograph Lumen Up-Down. And it's a piece which is in many ways the culmination of several ranges from this iconic brand. And of course the Datograph itself is regarded by many as one of the greatest chronographs currently on the market, with the rather impressive additional complication of having the up-down power reserve indicator at the bottom of the dial added in. And the watch itself follows the same lines as the conventional watch. However, because this watch is the Lumen version, and all the Lumen versions previously produced by Lange Söhne have been platinum, this piece does have a platinum case. It's 41mm in diameter by 13.4mm thick. The case itself features a very typical design of this brand, with a very Teutonic design, with very tall and sharply edged sides, with a brushed form along the sides, and then polishing on the bezel and in some places around the lugs. Of course, the watch also features those square pushers, and of course sapphire crystals on the front and the back of the watch. The watch also retains a 3-atmosphere water resistance, and does also contain a movement which is very similar to what's conventionally seen in the normal up-down version of the Datograph. And in terms of complications, the watch has the very traditional set of the power reserve indicator at the bottom of the dial, the large date at the top of the dial, of course the tachometer around the edge of the dial, and of course that centrally mounted flyback chronograph with those offset subdials running the running seconds on the left and the 30 minutes of the chronograph on the right. But from there on in, the watch is subtly different to the standard Datograph. If one takes the movement, for instance, one sees it's the caliber L951.7, which features in many ways a very similar design with a German silver base of exquisite detail, and these really are wonderful pieces to see, with gold chaton heat-blued screws, and also an untreated German silver form for the bridges, and so one has this material used instead of conventional choices. And what this means is you get a particular luster, which is distinctive to the brand, and is something we've come to expect from this particular house. It also is striped, of course, and it also has that beautiful hand-engraved balance cock, of which no two are the same. Then also has a free-sprung balance, and runs at a somewhat conservative 18,000 vibrations per hour, but of course has the swan neck regulator. But a few details do arise which are different to the standard version. This movement, for instance, is 0.2mm thicker at 8.1mm thick to the earlier 7.9mm of the older version. One also has 3 extra parts, raising the count to 454 parts, which is an interesting detail, and both of these elements are important when one considers the way the watch has been modified to accommodate this Lumen treatment. The first hint at this watch's abnormality, though, is seen in the dial, which has a slight haze to its surface, but is clear as you can see, and so one can see through into the inner workings of the movement, and one can see the large date underneath it. Interestingly, this is important because it allows the elements underneath the dial to charge, which means that when the date changes at midnight, the following date is also luminous, and so has been exposed to the sun during the day, which is a crucial element, of course, for a watch of this type. However, there is also luminous treatment to the Lange Söhne ring around the edge of the dial, in addition to all of the hands and also the subdials, which means that you can read the watch in its full functionality at night, which is not normally something you can say off the Datograph. Understandably, these pieces are being made in very small numbers of 200 pieces, and of course these are being also sold at a very high price of 95,000 euros. However, for the lucky few who do get to own these pieces, I'm certain they'll be the most exquisite pieces to own, with a beautiful level of finishing and a quality which is really unrivaled on the market. Because I must say I do prefer their way of going about things to some of the other very major houses of watchmaking. And of course, whilst that's a real preference, because the quality at the top end of watchmaking is very different from brand to brand, and varies not necessarily by how good it is, but just the manner in which it's executed, my heart really is with the products of this brand. And so I'll conclude this video here, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of my choices, because there were a great deal of other watches released this month, but I thought these showed the most interesting elements of the watch industry and also of watchmaking as a whole. So do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of them. And if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.